November 28, 1941. It is 9 days before Japan's Pearl Harbor attack will plunge the United States into World War II. Admiral William F. Halsey, at sea on the carrier Enterprise, delivering fighter planes to Wake Island deep in the Pacific, approves Battle Order Number 1. The Enterprise is now operating under war conditions.
Halsey's chief of staff burst into his cabin when he saw the orders to the fleet to arm and be ready for war, and questioned and saying, we can't go to war, we can't take actions like this, we're not at war. And Halsey said, I'll take responsibility for this, and we'll, in essence, shoot first and ask questions later.
Some who served with Halsey later in World War II would say he was not sufficiently skilled to command a large fleet. But those who fought with the barrel-chested, beetle-browed old sailor in the desperate early days would remember it was Halsey who arrived in the South Pacific when things were in chaos to restore dynamic leadership to a demoralized U.S. command. Dynamic, but hardly delicate.
I have been asked many times since I came back if there's such a thing as a good Jap. My answer is yes. One that's been dead for 6 months.
Halsey would turn the war around in 30 extraordinary days and hound the Japanese fleet to the bottom from Pearl Harbor to Tokyo Bay. William Frederick Halsey Jr. was born on October 30th, 1882, in Elizabeth, New Jersey. His father, a naval officer, was one of a family of seafarers who Halsey remembered as big, violent men, impatient of the law and prone to strong drink and strong language. It was a foreshadowing of his own nature. His mother was Ann Masters Brewster, a descendant of William Brewster, spiritual leader of the Plymouth colony. Her austerity did not pass to young William. They called her Middy, and she was tough.
She rode her bicycle down the streets of Washington when she was 85 years old and fell off the bicycle and was put into the hospital. And we visited her in the hospital, and my sister said to her, Middy, you're doing fine, you look well. And she says, yes, Margaret, the reason for that is I've got guts. And she did have guts, and I think Dad absorbed a lot of that from her.
Young Halsey grew into a chunky, athletic boy who played excellently and studied indifferently. Heir to a footloose life, he took to it like the born sailor he was.
Dad was always, as a Navy junior, had been brought up by his dad and his mother to go into the Navy.
In 1900, when William was 13 years old, Ann Halsey used a family connection to wangle an appointment with President William McKinley. In asking for her son's appointment to the Naval Academy, she said, I have been praying. Madam, replied McKinley, making one of the best decisions of his doomed life, your prayers have been answered. Halsey entered Annapolis in 1900. It was a period when the Academy was experiencing a powerful resurgence on the heels of the Navy's brilliant performance in the winning of the Spanish-American War of 1898. A star on one of the worst football teams in Academy history, he was graduated a middling 42nd in his class.
And when he graduated, the only disappointing part of his commissioning was when the Chief Master-at-Arms of Annapolis came up to him and said, congratulations, Mr. Halsey, but you'll never be the naval officer that your father was. And that stuck with Halsey, and for the rest of his life, he wanted to show that he was indeed the naval officer that his father was.
When Halsey was in Norfolk, serving on a ship aptly named the Don Juan, a vivacious, sharp-tongued, blonde visitor named Fanny Grandy attracted his attention by knocking off his cap. A Yankee rebel romance was born.
Mom was from the South. She was from Norfolk, Virginia, and Dad was from Elizabeth, New Jersey. And they used to occasionally get into an argument, and at which time Mom would say, well, that's that damn Yankee blood coming out of you, Bill.
To demonstrate the burgeoning power of the United States Navy, President Theodore Roosevelt sent 16 battleships of what was called the Great White Fleet around the world in 1908. Ensign Halsey was aboard and would not return for a year. In Japan, he met Admiral Togo, who led the Japanese Navy to victory over the Russian fleet in 1905. Halsey sensed in the thinly veiled Japanese hostility the naval showdown to come. When he returned from his world cruise, Bill Halsey and Fanny Grandy were married in Norfolk on December 1st, 1909. The birth of his children, Margaret in 1910 and William III in 1915, were rare bright spots as Halsey's career was eddying aimlessly. In flotilla duty at Veracruz and Tampico during troubles with Mexico, and in desk duties at the Naval Academy.
When World War I broke out, Halsey did everything he could to get orders overseas. Never saw a German ship. He only dropped one depth charge. He said it was like kissing your first girl, but I didn't feel anything.
After brief tours in Washington and as a naval attaché in Germany, where he felt like a beached whale, Halsey returned to destroyer duty. In 1927, he made captain. Fanny Halsey, moving from place to place with her husband and family, didn't share his indifference to rootlessness. She said glumly that her impression of life with Bill was one of buying and abandoning garbage cans all over the world.
Mom ran the show at home. She was the boss at home, and when it came time to go back aboard ship, I think Dad was pretty bloody well ready to go back aboard ship.
By 1932, with the Japanese moving into Manchuria, most of the U.S. Navy had been sent to the Pacific. The growing tensions revived Halsey's languishing career.
I remember when I was a kid going out to some function aboard ship, and we were going out on Dad's gig. And when we were going out of the harbor at Long Beach, we passed by a couple of freighters taking scrap iron to Japan. And the old man was infuriated. He said, "By God, that's going to come back to us in bombs and torpedoes," and it sure did.
He was sent first to the Newport Naval War College, a gateway to high command. Then to the Army War College in Washington. And none too soon. He was already 50 years old. But at a White House party for flag officers' children, President Roosevelt told young William his father had been noticed.
And he said, "Are you young Bill Halsey?" And I said, "Yes, I am, sir." And he said, "Do you know that your father took me to Europe in his destroyer when I was the Assistant Secretary of the Navy?" And I said, "Yes, sir, I've heard that story many times." And he said, "Well, young Bill, I want you to go back and tell your father that I consider him to be one of the top officers in the service."
Suddenly, a crucial opportunity. A major fleet unit, the big fast aircraft carrier Saratoga, needed a skipper. There was a big hurdle to the job. To be sure the ship's commanding officer understood the ways of carriers and air combat, he would have to qualify as a carrier pilot. At age 51, Halsey found himself at Pensacola, Florida, competing with men half his age. Fanny howled, "What do you think the old fool is doing now? He's learning to fly." His weight dropped from 200 to 150 pounds. But he got his precious wings and his command. Commanding the Saratoga, he was awed by the pilot's ability not just to fly, but to shoot, bomb, navigate over empty seas, and land on a wind-blown, yawing, and pitching deck. His decision to lay in a supply of bourbon to tune his airmen's nerves had more to do with his respect for his men than with Navy regulations. The young Navy pilots were soon to need all the courage they could muster. The annihilating Japanese strike on Pearl Harbor that was to launch America into World War II and William Halsey into the history books occurred while he was still at sea delivering fighter planes to Wake Island. He searched recklessly for the vastly more powerful Japanese attack force. Luckily, he didn't find it and escaped certain destruction. Admiral Chester Nimitz, the new Pacific Fleet commander, saw a desperate need for carriers to strike the enemy at once, to unbalance him and restore American morale. He was opposed by admirals who doubted the carrier's abilities, but not by Halsey.
He stood behind Nimitz, supported him in what he wanted to do, and offered to lead the attack. This was something that Nimitz never forgot.
On February 1st, 1942, Halsey, commanding a force built around the carriers Enterprise and Yorktown, and supported only by cruisers and destroyers, launched the first U.S. strike on Japanese-held territory. His flyers caught the victory-flushed enemy unaware. American guns and planes attacked multiple targets, including Kwajalein in the Marshall Islands and Macon in the Gilberts. While the score in destroyed and damaged ships and planes was not high, the raid rattled the Japanese plans and provided a roaring public relations success for a beleaguered U.S. Navy and for America's first World War II naval hero, Admiral Bill Halsey. He always knew how to deal with the press. He looked and sounded like an aggressive admiral.
Somebody has suggested they want to know where the next Liberty port is. We're going to have a very rough Liberty that I'm going to lead in Tokyo in about 10 months. If there's anything left of the damn town, we're going to burn that up.
As Halsey's weather-worn face, some said it resembled a bulldog's, appeared more and more in the nation's newspapers, the press took to calling him Bull Halsey. It was a nickname he never liked, but it stuck. The pinprick of Halsey's attacks in the Marshalls and Gilberts, and later against Wake and Marcus Islands, didn't slow the Japanese advance. They surged on through Malaya, the Dutch East Indies, and the Philippines. But in fact, Japan was experiencing considerable anxiety. Beset with fears that included a possible carrier attack on the Emperor in Tokyo, they began planning a move against Midway Island to push the Americans backward. A steady diet of bad news weighed on American morale. Something spectacular was needed to shame the haughty Japanese military. A plan was hatched. A daring raid on Tokyo by Army B-25 bombers, flying off a thinly escorted aircraft carrier lying a few hundred miles off the Japanese coast. After loading Colonel Jimmy Doolittle's B-25s and their 80 crewmen aboard the Hornet, and once the Tokyo strike force was at sea, Halsey passed the word to the men. This force is bound for Tokyo. He would later say, in all my experience in the Navy, I have never heard such a resounding cheer as came up from the ship's company. The mission ran into a serious problem on the morning of April 18th, 1942, when a Japanese picket boat spotted the task force and was quickly sunk. Fearing that the Japanese crew had radioed a warning before going down, and still far outside his plane's intended launch point, Halsey had to make one of the most wrenching decisions of his career.
The question was whether to kick the bombers over the side and get out of there, or to launch them toward Tokyo. Halsey launched them, made this tough decision at the very far envelope of the launch range, and a great decision it was.
As with Halsey's previous strikes, the damage to Japanese dignity and peace of mind was more devastating than anything the munitions wrought. The Navy took full note of Halsey's part in the audacious operation. It was determined to make important use of the man who was providing America with a crucially needed spirit of combat as the battle for Midway loomed. The island must not fall.
And from Midway, Japanese planned to bring in a land-based air force, air fleet they call them, for round-the-clock bombings of Pearl Harbor. We would have had to evacuate Hawaii. So this was the big battle shaping up for the first 6 months of the war. And Halsey, the obvious guy to command all our available carriers, all of 3.
But a crippling attack of shingles caused him to miss the sea battle he had lusted for. He would call it the most grievous disappointment of my career. Destiny was saving other crises for Bull Halsey. While he was fighting to regain his health at home, American Marines were storming ashore at Guadalcanal in the Solomon Islands in August 1942. It was the ground troops' critical task to oust the Japanese occupiers who were trying to establish Solomon's air bases that would cut the vital lifeline to Australia. The land fighting was desperate for the 10,000 Marines ashore. For the U.S. Navy units who were supporting the operation under Vice Admiral Robert Gormley, it was worse than that. In a raging night battle off Savo Island, a Japanese naval force surprised the Allied ships screening the carriers Enterprise, Wasp, and Saratoga. In the melee, 4 heavy cruisers, 3 American and 1 Australian, went to the bottom.
The Battle of Savo Island was the most humiliating defeat the United States Navy sustained in World War II. Following upon it, there was a withdrawal of naval support, and thereafter the sea lanes to Guadalcanal were only tenuously maintained.
But it was terrible for the people who were there, down to eating captured Japanese rice and that sort of thing for the first 3 or 4 weeks, and eating about 2 meals a day, maybe, for the rest of the time.
The Japanese were free to send reinforcements down the central passageway of the Solomons, a watery graveyard of ships and men known as the Slot. Soon, enemy forces on Guadalcanal would be strong enough to overwhelm the cut-off Marines. Pacific Fleet Commander Admiral Chester Nimitz met to consider naval command in the area.
I think that Nimitz recognized in Dad an aggressive spirit that was particularly needed at a time when the Japanese were on the offensive. They needed somebody to get in there and say, come on, boys, let's turn this situation around.
In Halsey, what you had was a man of hot, visceral reaction, a man who lived to come to grips with the enemy and who infused others with precisely that desire.
Admiral Nimitz saw that Dad was an aggressive guy that wanted to go after the Japanese. He decided that the South Pacific Force needed that aggressive spirit, and he sent Dad down there to take command, which was a big surprise to the old man. He hadn't expected this at all.
On Guadalcanal, an officer recalled the troops getting word of Halsey's arrival. One minute, we were too limp with malaria to crawl out of our foxholes. The next, we were running around whooping like kids. But the Japanese were all around now.
The small U.S. force that was there was completely outnumbered in men and material, and the fact that the Japanese were on the go, and we were definitely on the defensive. And I think that was Dad's greatest moment.
Shortly after taking command, Halsey had an important meeting with General Vandegrift, the Marine commander on Guadalcanal. In the course of that meeting, Vandegrift said, politely but firmly, that he felt that they weren't receiving enough support. There was no comment, I think, Vandegrift could have made that would be more sure to strike home with Halsey. The Navy was not carrying its share. And Halsey was a man who, when aroused with a question like that, was going to come in with both fists.
The Japanese now gathered their forces for a powerful thrust at Guadalcanal. They smelled victory in the continuing inability of the Americans to check them at sea.
It appeared that Guadalcanal was about to be lost. The Japanese seemed to be getting the upper hand. It was feared that it would capture the island, capture the Americans and make prisoners of them. You'd have again another death march, as it had at Bataan.
The battle that followed was no masterpiece of surprise or tactics, but in it, the Japanese found that the Americans were now willing to come out and slug it out, that they had a commander willing to sting them no matter what the odds. In the action, the enemy lost twice as many planes with their irreplaceable pilots as did the Americans. And they also lost momentum. Furiously, they plotted anew to oust Halsey's stubborn naval forces from the Solomons. In November 1942, raging with frustration over their earlier failed attempts to capture Henderson Field, the Japanese readied an all-out effort to overwhelm the Marines on Guadalcanal. Halsey committed every ship he had.
The forces that he had immediately at hand only included some cruisers and destroyers. But he had made a pledge to defend the Marines on Guadalcanal, and that night, those cruisers and those destroyers faced Japanese battleships at close range.
Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, commanding Japanese naval forces, planned to bombard Henderson Field from the sea, strike it from carriers, and land a decisive contingent of troops on Guadalcanal. American codebreakers passed the word to Halsey. He gathered every ounce of his insight into a great, calculated gamble of all he had. He scraped together 6,000 reinforcements and headed them for Guadalcanal in 2 convoys, one supported by a cruiser-destroyer force under Rear Admiral Norman Scott, the other escorted by a similar force led by Rear Admiral Daniel Callaghan. As the American reinforcements landed at Guadalcanal, reports placed the onrushing enemy task force just 335 miles from the island. When the American transports were 90% emptied of troops, Halsey could wait no longer. He ordered them away, releasing their light screening forces under Admiral Scott and Callaghan to meet the heavy, fast-approaching Japanese bombardment force. On that bloody night in late 1942, Halsey put the whole Pacific War on the line in another of the great Solomon Sea clashes.
Crews spent hours cooped up in small confined spaces, heading on, groping in darkness towards an enemy they could not see. When the battles were finally joined, they were marked by the beams of searchlights feeling out across the waters, sending their nebular glow across to highlight enemy superstructure. Guns would fire and the shells would literally glow in the dark, sailing across in parabolas, crisscrossing. When they struck home on an enemy ship, you could see spark showers. If it was your ship, you felt the rumble and the roar of the hit, and then you heard the sizzling sound of shrapnel cutting through cables, pipes, and structure. That night, November 13th, 1942, both Admirals Callaghan and Scott died on the bridges of their ships.
Halsey wrote, "You know you have put your men into a fight, and you hope you've done everything possible to make that fight successful. But you are always searching your mind for something you may have left undone. It is a great mental agony." The cruiser Atlanta sank. The Juno went down, taking 5 Sullivan brothers with it. A Japanese battleship was riddled and 2 escorting destroyers sunk. But Halsey grieved at the loss of so many old friends.
After the naval battle of Guadalcanal, Halsey was honored by being promoted to full admiral, 4 stars. But he said, "I don't want to accept these, and I want you to send them, deliver them, to the widows of Admiral Scott and Admiral Callaghan, who died so bravely in the night action in the naval battle of Guadalcanal, and say, the valor of your husbands brought this honor to me."
Such losses to families brought Halsey's own family closer to his heart. His son, William III, was now a young officer in the Pacific under his father's command. They visited when they could. The sea battle's sacrifices had turned back the 13,500 Guadalcanal-bound Japanese reinforcements, if only for the moment, overwhelmed the defeated and starving Japanese. By February 1943, the battle for Guadalcanal was over. Halsey, always lightning fast with praise, told his men, "You have written your names in golden letters on the pages of history." Hail, heroes. Rest with God. But the fighting machine that was William F. Halsey would soon face new and dire. Any high-ranking officer who had any contact with the flamboyant Douglas MacArthur had a separate war to fight. Halsey, who had once called the general a self-advertising SOB, was no exception. The Pacific Theater's command division between Nimitz and MacArthur was ability between the two leaders of the Japanese War would hurt Halsey seriously later in the conflict. But he somehow managed a mutually respectful relationship with his son. The third generation of seagoing Halseys flew over from the carrier Saratoga to visit his father. The return flight should have been routine. It wasn't.
Halsey's chief of staff came in to see him. "I've got bad news for you, sir. 3 of our torpedo bombers are missing." Halsey looked at him. "Is my son on one of those planes?" "Yes, sir, I'm afraid he is. He's missing." "We're prepared to pull out all the stops to do everything we can to find him." Halsey shook his head, saying, "Don't do anything different than we would do for any other airman that's gone down at sea. Crashed near an island, but they found all of them, and they were all safe."
America's military leaders, in an effort to speed up the war, now decided to bypass key enemy bases like Rabaul and leapfrog across the islands of the Central Pacific. Bull Halsey drove a fast-tiring body and mind to keep up with the war's accelerating pace. Douglas MacArthur flared into predictable fury as the stepped-up pace. He dragged his feet until Halsey exploded.
Halsey startled the whole room, putting your personal honor above the good of our country. And let's get together and solve this like men working together. And everybody was aghast. Nobody ever talked to MacArthur like that. Halsey did. MacArthur listened.
A risky, brilliant carrier strike into the heart of the enemy's strength at Rabaul. He blasted a Japanese on Bougainville. Such was the damage from the daring raid that the American landings at Bougainville and
Aircraft carriers had never been used with such audacity except for the Japanese at Pearl Harbor. So this was the Halsey style, and this is where he really gained the love and respect of everybody in the fleet.
One day he was walking down the deck, he was behind some enlisted men, and one of them said, "I'd go to hell for that old son of a bitch." Halsey tapped him on the shoulder. "I'm not so old," he said.
By the time Halsey returned from a rotation to reassume command of the task force from Admiral Raymond Spruance, the Central Pacific thrust was engaged in heavy fighting in the Mariana Islands. Halsey's Third Fleet was a sprawling 15 aircraft, a far cry from the days when he had to make do.
He had always an early here he was of ships, and things began to get very sloppy. Well, he was always sloppy. But
Halsey's task was now to roam the hour. Sometimes derided as a mediocre tactician, he now suggested one of the most successful strokes of the Pacific War. Observing what seemed to be a Japanese vacuum off the Philippines, intermediate invasions, to move up the strike at Leyte by 60 days. As Halsey's carrier aircraft pounded the critical order, reading, "In case opportunity for destruction of major portion of the enemy fleet is offered or was the primary task." As he prepared for the battle to come, Bull Halsey couldn't have been happier. On October 20th, 1944, the forces of Douglas MacArthur went ashore in great strength at Leyte in the Philippines. What the rest of the fleet jokingly called MacArthur's Navy, the 7th Fleet under Admiral Thomas Kinkaid, was in direct support of the landing. Its 6 old battleships were good enough for bombardment and anti-aircraft, but not meant for surface-to-surface combat, which didn't seem important unless you knew that the Japanese were set to unleash what they called their show plan, aimed at annihilating the Leyte beachhead. Bull Halsey figured critically in that plan.
What they had to know by this point in the war was that this was an aggressive admiral, someone who was looking for a fight. And part of that plan called to lure Halsey away from Leyte Gulf, to get him away from the landing site so that Japanese forces could get in and do damage there.
As part of the show plan, massive Japanese fleet units approached the San Bernardino and Surigao Straits to the north and south of the Leyte beachhead. MacArthur was unworried, even though his own sea defense force consisted of just Admiral Jesse Oldendorf's old battleships and 3 to port of Halsey's overwhelming force of fast battleships and a steel umbrella of carrier-borne aircraft. When scout planes spotted the huge Japanese force closing on Leyte from the west, Halsey gave the order to strike. The vast air armada flew off his carriers to challenge the Japanese fleet. Without an Imperial carrier to be seen, the Japanese naval force was severely battered by the American planes. Halsey now transmitted a battle plan to his top commanders. If a surface engagement offered itself, he would detach from the main Task Force 34, charged with protecting the San Bernardino Strait. Now the confusions would begin to mount. As Halsey paced the bridge, wondering aloud where the Japanese flat tops were, Admiral Jisaburo Ozawa moved his carriers into position to the north of Halsey. But his force was there as a lure, and he had only a shadow complement of planes. The effort was designed to entice the American naval force away from the San Bernardino Strait and the Leyte beachhead. Could the Japanese turn Bull Halsey's relentless belligerence into the engine of his defeat? The Japanese didn't have to wait long to see if Halsey took the bait and moved to attack the virtually planeless carriers of their northern decoy force. Heart racing, he ordered his task force to speed north and engage. Halsey radioed his departure, sensing that his undying wish, a no-holds-barred surface naval engagement, was about to be realized. The 7th Fleet's Admiral Kinkaid didn't give Halsey's departure a thought, confident that Task Force 34, as promised, had been formed and detached to guard the San Bernardino Strait. In fact, Halsey had not done so.
He'd been trained in the early Navy at the War College, where the concentration of forces was always emphasized, the Mahanian tradition. And as a result of that, Halsey was very reluctant to divide his forces. So when he made the decision to go north, he not only went north, but he took the whole show with him.
I think people criticized Dad maybe for being too impulsive. Impulsive he was at times, but this was also his strength. Because he closed with the enemy whenever he had the chance.
That night, Jesse Oldendorf's old battleships covered themselves with new glory as they smashed a Japanese thrust at the Surigao Strait in an old-fashioned gun duel. But a more powerful arm of the Japanese pincer had doubled back toward the San Bernardino Strait, news which did not immediately reach Halsey due to the cumbersome command structure in place. As Kinkaid learned of the huge enemy force approaching San Bernardino, he radioed Halsey to ask if Task Force 34 had been formed. The reply stunned him. Negative. Task Force 34 now with carrier groups engaging enemy carrier force. Then Halsey learned the worst. A large enemy force was bearing down on the Leyte beachhead with only Taffy 3, a small group of escort carriers and some destroyers and destroyer escorts, to stand against the guns of the Japanese battleships. By this time, Halsey planes were annihilating the carriers of Ozawa's decoy force. He didn't worry about Kinkaid's strident calls for help until he got word that the old battleships facing the Japanese threat were armed mostly with high explosives for bombardment and lacked armor-piercing ammunition for a major naval engagement. Then another message, this time from Nimitz, rocked him.
The message from Admiral Nimitz was, where is Task Force 34? The padding that had to be placed on the side of these messages to confuse the code breakers included the words, "The world wonders." These were not taken out when the message in its raw form was given to Admiral Halsey on the flag bridge. So it read as if Nimitz was saying, "The world wonders, where is Task Force 34?" The message was devastating to Halsey. He couldn't believe that his friend and his boss had accosted him in this manner. He flung his hat down on the bridge, he threw the message away, he broke into tears.
Racing south now, knowing it was too late to intervene in the battle raging there, Halsey wrote, "I turned my back on the opportunity I had dreamed of since my days as a cadet." He would call his decision to break off with Ozawa the only one I regretted in the entire war. Off Samar, Taffy 3, with its ill-equipped planes and suicidal torpedo and gun attacks on battleships, performed the incredible feat of turning back the superior Japanese force with the loss of only a few American ships. But many of the main and decoy Japanese naval units had escaped. Although the Leyte beachhead was saved, Halsey's decision is still hotly controversial.
He spent a lot of his post-war years writing various articles about what the situation was in Leyte Gulf and how he reacted. I would have rather had him enjoy his post-war years a little bit more than to have spent them trying to defend himself in regards to Leyte Gulf.
As the war continued, Halsey fought on doggedly, but exhaustion and the effects of 10 cups of coffee, 40 cigarettes, and only 5 hours of sleep a day were taking their toll. Even nature conspired against him. Trying to keep a promise to MacArthur to stay close in while supporting the Philippine landings, he involved his ships in a disastrous typhoon that capsized 3 destroyers, killed over 750 men, and destroyed 186 planes. A court of inquiry put much of the blame on Halsey, but Admiral Nimitz loyally defended the Navy's old star. In the end game of the war, as battle-hungry as ever, Halsey slammed the Japanese home islands almost at will, still savoring revenge for the attack on Pearl Harbor. Told that the enemy was ready to surrender, he snapped, "Have we got enough fuel to hit the bastards one more time before they quit?" On the morning of August 15th, 1945, the same officer who had told him of the attack on Pearl Harbor informed him that the Japanese had surrendered. "God be thanked," Halsey breathed. "I will never have to order another man to die." He was later honored as a signer of the document of surrender. Late in 1945, Bull Halsey was made a 5-star admiral by President Harry S. Truman. He dealt with peacetime better than many of the old heroes, enjoying a stint as a corporate relations executive at ITT. Although he failed in a heartfelt attempt to save his beloved enterprise from the scrap heap, he did rediscover the joys of family.
Dad, in his last few years, used to come out and visit us in La Jolla for about a month every August or July. He was a wonderful old fellow. The kids loved him, the grandchildren looked forward to his coming out. He was just a nice old man. Everybody loved him. He was a tender guy. He wasn't the old tough guy from the war at all.
Fleet Admiral William F. Halsey, Jr. died peacefully on Fisher's Island, New York, on the 16th of August, 1959. He was buried with full military honors at Arlington National Cemetery. An old sailor, home from the sea.
He was a man who inspired others with his zeal. In later years, sailors would simply say when his name was mentioned, "I sailed with Halsey."
If anyone can come up with a contribution to winning the war in the Pacific that even approaches that magnitude, I'd like to argue with him.
He was a genuine hero. That word's become trite in our day and age, but Halsey was a bona fide hero.
Time magazine published an obituary in which they said, in the Navy-Army football game of 1904, the best Navy player was a little fullback named Halsey, who ran from sideline to sideline in the mud, making tackles all over the field. And that is the way he went through life.
Naval historian Samuel Eliot Morison, one of Halsey's principal critics, would still write of him, "His appointment at the darkest moment of the Guadalcanal campaign lifted the hearts of every officer and bluejacket." He hated the enemy with an unholy wrath and turned that feeling into a grim determination by all hands to hit hard again and again and win. Americans can be tough on their heroes, but Douglas MacArthur, a man never quick to praise, gave Bull Halsey this most memorable epitaph, writing to him, "When you leave the Pacific, Bill, it becomes just another damned ocean."